Morning everyone, thank you for joining us this morning. This is a physics live group tutorial on national and global energy. I'm sure lots of you have joined us for these before and for physics specifically, but I'll just give a reminder of how this will work. So this will be a 1 hour session, we'll finish at 11:15, and our wonderful tutor Preshayla will take you through the content of this topic. Lots of you know Preshayla already. She studies physics at Loughborough University. It should be a great session today. And then at the end, we will have some time for some questions from you guys. So if you do have any questions, either about the content that Preshayla is going through or the online school, just pop those in the chat or the Q&A. We will keep an eye on those as the session goes along, and Preshayla will answer some questions throughout, but we'll also have some time at the end for a short Q&A. You guys, just to answer any questions we might have missed. And just a reminder of the other sessions that are going on today, as I know some of you attend other subjects. After this, we have English, then we have maths and chemistry in the afternoon. So hopefully see some of you in those other sessions today. And finally, a reminder that all of these live tutorials are recorded and you can find them on the My Tutor YouTube channel, along with some other topic videos that should be really handy for revision. So if you wanted to catch up on any of the past physics sessions that Preshayla's run, you can catch up on those there. And yeah, do ask any questions in the chat and Q&A along the way, and we'll do our best to answer them. Cool, are you all good to go, Preshayla?
Yeah, all good.
Nice, have a good lesson, guys.
Okay, so what we're going to be covering today is really about renewable and non-renewable energy sources, the different types that we have, so what it means to be a renewable energy source, know how to describe the power, the advantages and the uses of all the different energy sources that we have, understand what it means for an energy source to be reliable, learn about the patterns and trends of energy in modern day society, and to see energy from a global perspective. We'll go through lots of example questions and then we'll have time for questions at the end. Okay, so I'm just going to start with a summary of yesterday's webinar if you weren't there, or just to kind of refresh your memories. So yesterday we talked about energy transfers. So we started off by looking at the behaviour of energy and in open, closed and isolated systems. And then we went on to talk about what wasteful energy is and what are the waste energies in lots of types of scenarios. Then we went on to talk about the efficiency equation with power and energy. So if you remember, the efficiency equation is the useful power over the total power, or the useful energy over the total energy. So it can be interchanged with power and energy. How can we reduce energy transfer to waste? So we talked about two methods that can allow us to reduce the amount of energy that we waste. So we used the example of a house and we looked at all the different ways that heat energy can be lost in a house. So whether that be through the windows, the doors, the roof, or even the floorboards. We looked at different ways of reducing that waste energy. So the first one we looked at was lubrication. Now, although this doesn't apply to a house, it is really important for reducing frictional forces to make things easier to move and waste less energy as heat. Okay, so we looked at lubricating wheels and surfaces so that we reduce the frictional force. By reducing the frictional force, we are then able to reduce the heat energy because friction creates heat. Thermal insulation, then we went on to talk about, which was in the house. So we talked about cavity wall insulation, roof insulation, double glazing windows and that sort of thing. So different ways that we can reduce the waste energy in our house. Then we went on to talk about thermal conductivity, which is this idea of how hard it is for a material to pass heat, or how easy it is for a material to pass heat. And we learned about if a material has a low thermal conductivity, it doesn't pass heat very easily, and it's a bad conductor, and vice versa. So that was all about thermal conductivity. And we said that there was no equation that you needed to know for that. It was simply just the definition and being able to apply it to different materials and different scenarios. Finally, we went on to talk about the required practical. So that was all about investigating insulation and different insulators. So we took 4 beakers, 4 thermometers, took some boiling water. We measured how long it took for the boiling water to cool down at 3-minute intervals. And the ways that we changed it, so our variables, were the materials for the first part of the experiment. So we did the experiment with 4 different materials, and then we repeated the experiment, but instead of using different materials, we kept the same material but varied the thickness. So what we are investigating in that practical is, number 1, how does the type of material affect the conduction or the insulation? And how does the thickness of the material affect the insulation? Okay, so that was yesterday's webinar. As always, if you do want to find out more, then go onto our YouTube channel. But today's webinar is all about energy resources. So there are lots and lots of energy resources that you'll see in this diagram here. So we have 9 different energy resources that we use on this earth in varying ways. So we have fossil fuels, nuclear fuels, biofuels, wind, hydroelectricity, geothermal, tidal, and solar and water waves. Okay, so they're all used in different amounts. Fossil fuels and nuclear fuels tend to be the most used out of the 9, with water waves and tides less so. Some are renewable and some are non-renewable. So we're just going to go through each energy resource, talk about whether it's renewable, whether it's non-renewable, its advantages, its power, and its uses. So before we get onto that, what does it really mean for an energy resource to be renewable? Okay, a renewable energy resource is defined as one that is being or can be replenished as it is used. Okay, so if you were to cut down a tree for energy, the tree would need to be replanted. At the same time, another tree is being cut down. Okay, so it's constantly being replenished. We don't have to wait to get more in and then start making energy again. The uses of energy that we have in modern day society is mainly transport, electricity, generation and heating. So generation is just the generation of electricity. Now, although renewable sources have no fuel cost, they are very expensive to build in the first place. Okay, so although we don't need to be burning coal, oil or gas to run them, they are very expensive to build initially, which is why we are so reluctant as a society to introduce renewable resources and have to pay that upfront cost, because it is a lot. Although it is better for the environment in the long run, it's kind of a toss-up between how expensive it is and how damaging it is for the environment, which I'm sure you all know is a big topic in today's society. Okay, so let's now go through the energy resources that we have. So for each one, we're going to talk about these 5 different sections, and you do need to memorize these 5 different factors or kind of features of each resource. Okay, so it is quite memory based. Unfortunately, it is kind of definitions, memorization, and not calculation at all. So kind of it depends on the kind of person that you are, but if you are a more qualitative person, so if you like wordy things, definitions, memorization, then this is going to be a topic that might be strong for you. However, if you're more on the mathsy side, then this might take a little bit more work because it is really just memorizing. Okay, so fossil fuels is the first one that we have. And fossil fuels are oil, coal, and natural gases that we burn to create energy. It is the #1 most used energy resource in the world because it is so efficient. We can do it really quickly and really easily. But it is one of the most environmentally damaging ones that we have. Okay, so it is very bad for the environment. It releases carbon dioxide, which you can see over here, which causes global warming. The energy store that it uses is chemical, so it turns our chemical energy into other types of energy, so for example electric, and obviously it is a chemical energy store because it's fossil fuels, oil, coal and natural gases, so they're all types of chemical energy. Fossil fuels are non-renewable. We cannot harvest fossil fuels as quick as we use them, so they are not being constantly replenished, so they are non-renewable. And the uses of burning fossil fuels for energy is really all of the uses that we have, so transport, heating, electricity generation, and so obviously that makes it kind of the top contender for energy resources, as well as having a high power output. So many advantages, but also some quite bad disadvantages. Moving on then to nuclear fuel. So nuclear, its energy store is obviously nuclear. It's a non-renewable resource because we can't keep harvesting the chemicals that we need for the nuclear reactions to happen as quickly as we use them. It's used for electricity generation. It has a very high power output, but its environmental impact again is pretty bad. So it's kind of sad that the two top energy resources that we use in the world, fossil fuels and secondly nuclear fuels, are the most environmentally damaging. But we use them because their power is very high and they're very easy to use. The environmental impact of nuclear fuel is really the decommissioning of the nuclear plant. So places where we create nuclear energy are called plants. Okay, so we set up a nuclear plant and it runs for a long time, but eventually it starts to wear out and we need to decommission it. Okay, now decommissioning just means completely tearing it down, completely destroying it. But as you might know, nuclear can be very damaging to humans and animals and plants. Okay, so it has to be disposed of properly because it is radioactive. So there is going to be a lot of radioactive waste that comes from the decommissioning of this nuclear plant, and it needs to be disposed of safely. But the way that we do that is by burying it underground in big kind of metal vaults. Again, not very cost effective, and we're running out of space. Okay, so the environmental impact again is quite bad for nuclear. So moving on to biofuel. Biofuel is a lot better. It's a renewable source. Again, a chemical energy store because we're talking about bio. So that's things like algae, soy, and kind of plants that are creating our energy. It's a really up and coming way of creating energy in today's society and hasn't really been used much before. It's quite rare. So yes, renewable because we can replenish the materials that we're using to create this energy as quickly as we use them. The uses are wide, so transport, heating, electricity generation. Although it is just biofuel, it actually does have a lot of uses. The power output is medium, and the environmental impacts is carbon neutral, so low impact, meaning that it doesn't reduce any carbon, release any carbon. Okay, moving on to our next energy resource, we have wind. So wind takes kinetic energy and turns it into electricity, so electric energy. So it's really taking the wind and kind of making it turn the wind turbines, which I'm sure you've seen before. Those wind turbines then take that kinetic energy and turn it into electricity. It is renewable because we're always going to have wind. We can replenish the wind just as quickly as we use it, but it does have a very low power output because wind is not so strong and sometimes there is really no wind. So the power output really depends on how windy it is that day. So it's not very reliable. Okay, and then finally the environmental impact of wind. Well, it does take up large areas that could be used for farming. So you probably have seen wind farms, wind turbines do take up a lot of space, and some people do say that it spoils the view. So not very popular in that sense, and do have a very low power output, so not one that we tend to use a lot. Okay, hydroelectricity. So hydroelectricity is taking water and well, the flow of water from a height to a lower height and changing that into electricity. So this is quite a cool one because it takes gravitational potential energy and turns it into electricity. So you may have been there in the webinar where we talked about hydroelectricity dams, and we talked about how the water flowing from a high point to a low point takes its gravitational potential energy and turns it into kinetic energy, which turns a motor. Then that motor can create electricity. So it is probably one of the cooler ones that we have. It is renewable because we always have water and we can always make water flow. Its uses tend to be limited to electricity generation, and it has a medium power output. Its environmental impact is that the local habitats are affected by the large areas that need to be flooded to build dams. So as you can imagine, nobody's going to want a dam built near their kind of village, near their town. So animals, humans, houses are all affected by installing a hydroelectricity dam. Again, another reason why they aren't so popular. Geothermal is our next one. This takes the thermal energy of the earth and harvests it and turns it into electricity or heating. It's renewable. We're always going to have thermal energy in the earth. It's a medium power output, but its environmental impact is very low. It's not so commonly used just because its power output is not that high and it can cost a lot to build. Okay, the tides. This one's kind of a weird one because it's not one that you'd expect and is quite difficult to remember. So it's taking the tides, which again we always have, so it's renewable, and taking that kinetic energy and turning it into electricity. So they're planted in the sea in bodies of water, and the kinetic energy of the tide coming in and out allows us to create electricity. However, this is very, very hard to do. Very hard to build the equipment and very hard to harvest the kinetic energy that comes from the tides. The environmental impact is that the tidal barrages can block sewage which needs to go out to sea. So again, not commonly used for that reason. The sun, so this is all about kind of solar panels and the radiation that comes from the sun, which is a nuclear energy store. Renewable, we're always going to have our sun. We can use our sun just as much as the sun is kind of created. Power output depends really on the weather, so it's only available during daylight. So for that reason, it is not very commonly used in dark, cold countries, so for example England, but is more used in hotter countries which have daylight for longer, and therefore is not so reliable because we just don't know what the weather's going to be like, especially now with global warming. The environmental impact is very little, however, so that is a pro. Finally, we have water waves. So water waves is really just taking waves in the sea, the kinetic energy, and turning it into electricity. It's renewable, we always have water waves. However, the power output is low, so it's not commonly used for that reason. And the environmental impact is, again, very low. Okay, so what does it mean for a resource to be reliable? Well, for a resource to be reliable, it needs to be the stock needs to be kind of easily replenished. So fossil fuels and nuclear fuels are really easy to get, really easy to run, cheap to run, and have a very high power output. So really for the world, the main important thing for us is the power output of the energy resource. If it's got a high power output and it's kind of easy to run and decommission, it's going to make it a really viable resource. However, for a energy resource to be non-reliable, well, that is really going to depend on the weather. So for the sun and hydroelectric power, they are kind of less so reliable. Kind of, if we know that the weather's not going to change, if we know that we're always going to have water, if we know that we're always going to have wind, that makes it reliable. But as soon as the weather starts changing, that's when it starts to become unreliable. Wind and solar are weather dependent, so they aren't reliable. However, tidal and hydroelectric power are more so reliable because we're always going to have the tide because of the moon, and we're always going to have hydroelectric power because we always have water and we can always build dams. So they don't really depend on the weather, which makes them more reliable. Okay, so the patterns and trends in the use of energy sources. So for your GCSE specification for EdXL, for AQA, for OCR, they really want you to be kind of energy aware and globally aware of what is going on in today's society with energy resources. So we're going to take it back to hundreds of years ago, where humans only really needed wood to create their main energy source for fire. So for heating, for light, and that's all they really used. Remember, they didn't have electricity, they didn't have any technology, so there was no need for them to be using great power stations to create electricity. Now, however, society has obviously changed. We've had amazing new technologies created, and we really live in a digital world. So our needs are different. Okay, we have much more of a need for electricity in today's society. However, as you know, our environment is getting more and more damaged every day. And this is because we're burning fossil fuels as our main resource of energy, which is a really bad thing to do. Burning fossil fuels releases carbon dioxide, which is damaging and creates global warming, so it's very bad for our environment. Therefore, scientists are trying to develop renewable resources. However, this can be difficult and costly. So although it is an up and coming trend, it is slowly evolving. The demand for energy also does vary with the time of year and the time of day. So it's important to remember that energy is going to be required more at night and in winter because we need it for light and we need it for heat. Okay, so the demand for energy does kind of vary throughout the year, so that is something to keep in mind. So looking at energy from a global perspective, well, if we look to political and economic pressures that different countries have, that can really heavily influence energy choices. So Saudi Arabia, for example, you may know that their main export is oil. So they extract oil, they export oil, and that is what their economy heavily relies on. So they are obviously kind of rooting for fossil fuels because that's what's keeping them in business. They're extracting the oil, they're exporting the oil, and we're using it, we're burning it, and we're creating energy. So they kind of have a vested interest in burning fossil fuels. So they're all for burning fossil fuels, no matter how much it damages the environment. So they definitely want fossil fuels to be continued into the future and constantly be used as an energy source. Okay, so that is all the content that we have for today. And that is actually the end of the energy topic. So again, if you do have any questions about today's webinar, put them on the chat. But if you do have any questions about any of the energy webinars that we've been through this week, then that's absolutely fine. I can answer questions about them as well. Okay, so let's move on to our questions. So we've got lots of time for questions today, which is great. So could you please answer, first of all, these two questions? So what is a non-renewable energy resource, and which of these is a renewable energy resource? So put your answers in the chat. Okay, so a non-renewable energy resource is a resource that will eventually run out because there are finite supplies. So an example of this is fossil fuels, so coal, oil and gas. We're not going to have them forever. We can't keep extracting them forever, so that is non-renewable. Which of these is a renewable energy resource? That would be hydroelectric power. The reason that it is renewable is because water is obviously easily replenished. Okay, so moving on to the other two questions. Which of these is not a fossil fuel, and which gas is linked to global warming? So put your answers on the chat. Cool, lots of you are saying uranium. Yes, uranium is not a fossil fuel. Uranium is a radioactive source that is used in the creation of nuclear fuel. And which gas is linked to global warming? That would be carbon dioxide. So we're constantly trying to reduce our carbon dioxide emissions to reduce the impacts of global warming. Which of these is a non-renewable energy source? And which of the following energy sources would be the best option for a windy, tropical island with no fossil fuels? So which of these is a non-renewable energy resource? Remember, non-renewable means that it will not always be replenished. And so that would be fossil fuels. Which of the following energy sources would be the best option for a windy, tropical island with no fossil fuels? Well, a windy island is obviously going to want to use wind turbines. That's going to be great for an energy resource. Tropical island means that it will be quite hot. So solar panels might be a good option. However, it doesn't have fossil fuels. So we can cross this one out. And so we know that solar panels and wind turbines would be our best option. Okay, so solar panels because it's tropical, wind turbines because it's windy. What is an advantage of using fossil fuels, and when would there be the most demand for energy in the UK? Okay, so the advantage of using fossil fuels is that they're reliable. And when would there be the most demand for energy in the UK? During winter in the early evening, because we need more light and we need more heat. Why do countries with growing economies such as China and India tend to use energy sources that are non-renewable and less clean? So countries such as China and India tend to use energy resources that are non-renewable to ensure that their industry continues to grow. Okay, so they want reliable, fast, high power energy resources that can kind of hold up their economy and their industry. So you might know that China and India are huge countries with lots of kind of businessy areas which need lots of energy to power, and their industries for China are factories and India have lots of factories. So obviously use a lot more energy than other countries. So they need fast, reliable, powerful energy resources, and they don't tend to care about the environmental damage that that has. So fossil fuels are really, really highly used in China and India because they're powerful, they're fast, and they're reliable. So they can power their economy. Which of these are likely to be used more in the future? So coal, oil and gas, nuclear fuel, oil and coal, or wind power, wave power, and hydroelectricity. And why would those energy resources tend to be used more? Cool. So some of you are saying wind power, wave power, and hydroelectricity, which is correct. So remember, they are renewable sources of energy, which is really good for the environment. It has low environmental impact. They're more eco-friendly. Okay, where does most of our energy come from in the UK? And which statement best describes the trend in energy usage in the UK over the past 150 years? Is it energy use has decreased due to a falling population and less demand for energy? Energy use has not changed a great deal, even though the population has increased, or energy use has increased due to new technology and machinery? So most of our energy comes from fossil fuels, and energy has increased due to new technology and machinery being introduced all the time. Which of these is an advantage of gas power stations? They can start producing electricity quickly, they make use of a renewable source, or they don't contribute to global warming. And which energy resource is the least reliable? 30 more seconds to get your answers in. Okay, so an advantage of gas power stations is that they can start producing electricity quickly, which is what makes them so popular. People want fast, powerful energy as quickly as they can. Which energy resource is least reliable? Well, that's wind. Obviously, we never know what the wind's going to do, and so it makes it a really unreliable resource, as well as the fact that it has a low power output, so it's very uncommon and very unpopular. Okay, so this is a long answer question, and I think it's a 4-mark question, which comes up in the GCSE quite a lot. So it takes 2 different energy sources and it makes you compare them to each other, talking about the advantages of using one over the other. Okay, so really common GCSE question. So this one is comparing nuclear fuels and wind as 2 energy sources which we use to generate electricity in the UK. So it's taking care of the uses for you, and it's told you that both create electricity. It's asking you to explain the advantages of using energy from nuclear fuels over using energy from wind. Okay, so why would we use nuclear fuels more than using wind fuels? Wind. So it says, include in your answer a brief description of the process used to generate electricity from nuclear fuels. I want you to ignore this because this is not part of your specification anymore. Okay, so that's one thing to note, is that you don't need to know the processes of creating the energy. Okay, so you don't need to know how a hydroelectricity dam creates electricity. You do need to know the advantages and the uses and all of that, but don't worry about knowing the processes. They took that out of your GCSE, even if you do higher tier. So what would be the advantages of using nuclear fuels then? Put some ideas on the chat. I want to see what you guys think is the advantages of using nuclear fuels over kind of using wind. So I'll give you just a few seconds to have a think about what the advantages are. Okay, so lots of answers in the chat, which is some really good ideas. So yes, nuclear is more powerful than wind energy, so that would be an advantage. It's more powerful. It's definitely more reliable. We can keep getting coal, oil and gas right now. It creates electricity faster than wind energy does. It's more reliable because we don't know if there's going to be wind all the time every day. Yeah, so they are kind of ideas that I'd put in this question, so that's really good. Now, one thing to note about this question before I move on is that it says explain the advantages of using energy from nuclear fuels. Okay, so don't talk all about the advantages of using wind. This question is kind of getting you to favour nuclear fuels. So it's asking you, why would we use nuclear fuels? Yes, over wind, but why would we use nuclear fuels? Okay, so this question wants you to focus more on nuclear fuels than it does wind. Okay. Cool. So the next one talks about solar energy. Solar energy is a renewable energy source used to generate electricity. What is meant by an energy source being renewable? And name 2 other renewable energy sources used to generate electricity. So I'll give you 1 minute to think about what the answers might be there. So what is meant by an energy source being renewable? So it's defined as a source that can be replenished as it is used. And 2 other renewable energy resources that we have. So you can have hydroelectric, tidal, wind, biofuel. They're all examples of renewable energy resources. In the UK, over 70% of the electricity is generated in power stations that burn fossil fuels. So remember, fossil fuels is the #1 way that we create energy in the UK, sadly. So explain one effect that burning fossil fuels has on the environment. So we talked about it briefly at the beginning. What is wrong with burning fossil fuels? What effect does burning fossil fuels have on the environment? Okay, so there's only kind of really one answer for this, and it is that they produce carbon dioxide, which contributes to global warming. Okay, so carbon dioxide is obviously bad for global warming. Give one way the effect on the environment described in part AI could be reduced. So what is another way that we can reduce carbon dioxide emissions? So we already know one way, which is burning fossil fuels, reduce the amount that we do that. But what is another way? We haven't talked about it today, but it might be interesting to see if you can think of another way that we can reduce carbon dioxide emissions. You might have heard it in the news. or on the TV. What is another way? Assuming the amount of fossil fuels that we burn stays the same, how else can we reduce carbon dioxide emissions? Okay, lots of great answers in the chat there. So Emma said carbon capture, that's absolutely correct. Arjun said catalytic converters, a more advanced answer, but still absolutely correct. Emit CO2 underground, that's really what carbon capture aims to do. So yeah, that's some really good answers there. Plant more trees is also another option for increasing reducing the carbon dioxide in the air, and remove the sulfur before burning fuel. So this one's kind of a little bit more of a rare answer. Nobody tends to put it, but if you did kind of think about saying removing the sulfur before you burn the fuel, then that's obviously another way that we can reduce the effect on the environment. Okay, so electricity can also be generated in a pumped storage hydroelectric power station. An advantage of pumped storage hydroelectric power stations is the short startup time that they have. So what is the importance of a short startup time? And if you've done that, then give one other advantage of a pumped storage hydroelectric power station. Okay, so the reason that we place importance on a short startup time is so that the power station can be used to meet surges in demand. So if there is a surge in demand, it can power up quickly and start creating energy quickly. Other things that you could have had is that it starts generating in a short time. Believe it or not, that is an answer that you could have had. However, saying switch on quickly is insufficient for this. Okay, what's another advantage of using a pumped storage hydroelectric power station? Well, that would be that it's a renewable energy resource and therefore gives out less pollutants, like CO2 gases, sulfur dioxide gases. Okay, so that would be another advantage, as well as having a short startup time. Okay, so this question asks you to read this section of an article. So in the future, it may not be possible to have constant electricity. Families will have to get used to using power when it's available. In the UK, the proportion of electricity generated using wind turbines is due to increase a lot. Some opponents of wind turbines think this will increase This increase will cause big fluctuations in electricity supply. So why might this be true? Why might using wind turbines more and more mean that we have fluctuations in our electricity supply? So think about the nature of wind. And have a think about the other question as well. Between 2002 and 2008, the amount of electricity used for lighting in homes in the UK decreased. Why might this be? So 1 more minute to have a think about that. Okay, so this one is probably a little bit more of a difficult one. So for wind, wind is obviously an unreliable energy resource. Turbines obviously can't produce at a constant rate because it's not always constant wind. So wind and wind speed fluctuates, and therefore we would have big fluctuations in the electricity supply that we have. Between 2002 and 2008, the amount of electricity used for lighting in homes in the UK decreased. So why might this be the case? Well, if you did talk about it was lighter between 2002 and 2008, that would be an incorrect answer because we can't just, our sun just can't suddenly get kind of more powerful. So what you needed to talk about in this answer was how people behave and how they use their energy. So something like using more energy efficient lighting is being used. So the introduction of LED bulbs in the house means that we have more energy efficient light bulbs. So they're being more and more used, more and more developed. We may have had an increased energy cost, which might mean that less people use less energy because it's more expensive, or you could have even had that more people are becoming environmentally aware. So any of those reasons would have been fine, but saying that it was kind of lighter would not be an appropriate answer. Okay, so about half of the UK's electricity is generated in coal-burning power stations and nuclear power stations. Coal-burning power stations and nuclear power stations provide a reliable way of generating electricity. What is meant by a reliable way of generating electricity? What makes an energy resource, an energy source, reliable? So to be reliable, we can say that the energy source is constant. It does not rely on uncontrollable factors such as weather. and it can really generate all of the time. So there would be some examples of an energy source being reliable. For the next one, over the next few years, most of the older nuclear power stations in the UK will be closed down and the process of decommissioning will start. What does it mean to decommission a nuclear power station? So to decommission a nuclear power station means to remove all the radioactive waste that we have. So we need to get rid of anything that has been affected by the nuclear radioactivity, and we need to kind of destroy it. So that's what it means to decommission. Okay, we're going to stop there with the example questions. I'm going to go through some questions that you guys have. So Ria asks, how much of the money that we pay for energy bills is wasted energy? So it really depends on what your house is like. If you have double glazing windows, if you have kind of roof insulation, if you have cavity wall insulation, that's going to be more cost effective. So less of your money is getting wasted to heat just leaving through the windows, and it's really being used to kind of heat your house efficiently. So it really depends on the features that you have in your house which make heat energy stay in. Okay. Other questions?
Someone's just asked, is this AQA?
Yeah, so these questions are all AQA. Any example questions that I give you are based on the AQA exam board. However, they are similar. So LXR is very similar to AQA, and OCR is similar. But yeah, I would definitely say check your specification, because some specifications require you to know a little bit more in depth. But this is all AQA.
Someone's asked, how long does it usually take to decommission?
So to decommission a nuclear plant is going to take a long time. So it can take up to 50 years to decommission a nuclear plant. But it really depends on how big the nuclear plant is. So obviously all that radioactive waste needs to be destroyed, because it's really harmful to humans. So it needs to be buried, it needs to be burnt, and so it can take a really long time. But yeah, I think it all has to be done within 60 years, but it can take kind of up to 50 years to decommission a nuclear plant.
Thank you. And in your opinion, what is the best renewable power source?
In my opinion, the best renewable energy source, I haven't really thought about this. Let's have a look. I would probably say hydroelectricity dams. So it really just takes water, which we have obviously plenty of. It doesn't contaminate the water, it doesn't do anything bad to it, it doesn't release any pollutants. It really just takes the kind of gravitational potential energy of the water and changes it into electricity, which I personally think is quite a cool way of creating electricity. So yeah, I'd probably say that is the best one. It has quite a good power output, and although it does kind of disturb neighbouring villages, it is such a good way of creating energy. So yeah, that would probably be my top renewable energy resource.
Nice, thanks Preshayla. I think we'll wrap up there. So thank you for today's session, and thanks everyone for engaging with all the questions. That was great. As usual, if you wanted to rewatch this session or any of our past sessions, just head over to the My Tutor YouTube channel. And just a reminder of the other sessions happening today. We've got English coming up in 15 minutes, then we've got maths and chemistry this afternoon. But if you just join us for physics, then see you for the next session next week. And the timetable will be up tomorrow afternoon, so you can check out all the sessions next week. Lovely, so have a great afternoon, everyone, and see you in another session soon. Bye.
Bye, thank you.